Kyle Sechi, with unwavering determination, embarked on a commercial ship bound for the border town, along with his family and over a dozen disciples. Leaving behind the alchemy workshop in the city of Crimson Water, he penned a farewell letter to his disciple Charles, resolute in his decision to venture to the border town. Just a few days prior, emissaries from Roland had arrived, seeking to recruit alchemists, accompanied by some fantastical formulas that pushed the boundaries of imagination. Kyle had always believed that the essence of alchemy lay in seeking truth amidst the chaos, but little did he expect that the fourth prince would offer him a revelation unlike any other. The direct current generator and the direct current motor have no structural differences. Essentially, they are the same thing, and their functions can be interchangeable. As long as other machines drive the rotor of the motor to rotate and continuously cut magnetic lines with the help of the conductor, an induced current can be generated continuously. With the assistance of Mystery Moon, aka Rem, and Anna, Roland was able to assemble a simple direct current motor in just a few hours. The stator part was entirely made of wood and then imparted with Rem's magnetism ability. The commutator segments were embedded in a piece of round wood, which had a central hole for connecting it to the steam engine shaft. This construction was not only convenient to manufacture but also ensured insulation between the commutator segments. Kyle finally met the fourth prince, inside the reception hall of the castle. After exchanging greetings, Kyle couldn't contain his excitement and eagerly wanted to learn more about the alchemical formulas. He could hardly believe that Roland had authored those formulas himself. Roland attributed his knowledge to ancient texts dating back 400 years. This revelation left Kyle even more bewildered. After all, the Alchemical Association in the capital had a history of less than 200 years. Did this mean that later generations were inferior to their predecessors? Roland explained to Kyle that in the book, the scholars from 400 years ago referred to alchemy as chemistry. They put forth a hypothesis that matter is indestructible. The substances that make up everything in the world do not disappear or increase, they merely transform from one form to another. Roland offered an apt analogy, but it didn't immediately convince Kyle. Kyle then posed a question: if a piece of wood is burned to powder, no matter how it is measured, the weight of the powder is lighter than that of the wood. If the matter is indestructible, where did the missing material go? Roland smiled and explained that it transformed into gas and water. The water evaporated due to the heat of the flame, leaving behind only the residue. Kyle found it hard to believe that gas also has weight. Roland took out a beginner's chemistry book from his desk and offered Kyle a job, with the same salary as in Crimson Water City, but with the requirement to sign a confidential agreement. Barav, who had been lurking in the background, suddenly appeared, startling Kyle. Roland's first task for Kyle was to create a highly concentrated acid. Nightingale emerged from the mist, pouting her little mouth. She accused Roland of deception. She knew that the introductory chemistry book was not some ancient text from 400 years ago, but rather something Roland had written himself. Roland knew that instead of directly telling Kyle the truth, it would be better to let him delve into it on his own and experiment, because people always believe in themselves the most. Suddenly, Nightingale lowered herself, leaning towards Roland, and asked who had taught him all this knowledge. Before Roland could respond, Nightingale pressed her finger against his lips, saying, "If you don't want to say it, then don't. I don't want to hear you lie." The prince handed over a peculiar-looking firearm, and Carter received it with both hands. The trigger and barrel resembled those of a flintlock musket, leading the knight to conclude that they belonged to the same type of weapon. It was not particularly large, but it felt surprisingly heavy in his hands, even more so than a flintlock rifle. What caught his attention was that, apart from the wooden grip, the entire gun was made of metal. Its sleek lines, angles, and gray-white metallic sheen exuded an indescribable beauty. Carter almost instantly fell in love with the weapon. He quickly discovered that its operation was simpler than that of a flintlock. The projectiles and gunpowder were already combined, and all he had to do was load the revolving cylinder in the middle to fire. The cylinder had 5 holes, allowing for the simultaneous loading of 5 rounds. Sparks and gases burst out from both sides of the cylinder, creating a deafening sound that made his ears ache. It felt as if someone had forcefully pushed him, causing his wrist to involuntarily rise. When the smoke cleared, the target appeared undamaged. Carter took a deep breath, firing the remaining 4 bullets, yet not a single one hit the target. Carter looked towards His Royal Highness, and Roland appeared unfazed. Smiling, Roland explained that due to the shorter barrel, pistols have inferior range and accuracy compared to rifles, so missing the target was quite normal. Additionally, with a bullet caliber close to 12 millimeters, the recoil was much greater than that of a flintlock. He reassured Carter that this was an unfinished prototype and that he needed Carter to practice continuously throughout the week. Before the competition, Carter must ensure that all 5 shots hit the target. Roland reminded Carter to remember to collect the spent casings. Carter looked at His Royal Highness and thought to himself, the prince is truly remarkable. Given time, he will undoubtedly ascend to the throne of Grey Castle. And I will do everything in my power to assist him. Ashes sat at the top of the castle, awaiting the day of the duel. As she gazed at the sunset, she felt a sense of helplessness. Over these past few days, her attempts to persuade the witch members had made no progress. Their stubbornness far exceeded her expectations. Whether they were the older, knowledgeable ones like Scroll or the young ones like Lily, they all rejected her invitation. The only difference was the manner in which they refused. Some chose to stay because of Roland, while others didn't want to leave their sisters. As for the small town, it was unlike any other town or village she had seen before. If she had to describe it, she would say that it was brimming with vitality. It seemed like the people here had endless tasks to accomplish every day. They always had a joyful smile on their faces. What kind of magic did Roland Wimbledon possess to ignite such enthusiasm among the townsfolk for building a desolate and barren little town? Just then, a chorus of cooing birds came from above. Ashes looked up and saw a giant, fat pigeon descending from the sky, landing on her shoulder. The pigeon nuzzled against her cheek. Ash asked if Tilly had sent her, and the pigeon cooed twice. Suddenly, Ashes grinned and scattered some grains on the rooftop. The fat pigeon flapped its wings and flew over, as if realizing something, and pecked Ashes with its sharp beak. While saying, "I'm not a bird." The feathers of the pigeon suddenly expanded, emitting a bright white light from between the gaps. Then, a head emerged, and the expanded feathers quickly shrank, transforming into a cascade of long white hair. No matter how many times Ashes witnessed it, she would always marvel at it. Maisie, a witch with the ability to transform into various birds, was exquisite in every detail, except for her enlarged size. Maisie was eager to meet the new witches, but Ashes sighed and briefly explained the situation. She told Maisie that the witches here didn't want to leave. Maisie thought that since Roland was Tilly's brother and they were both willing to accept witches, it was a good thing. However, Ashes shook her head and mentioned the upcoming duel in a few days. Ashes knew that even if she won, the witches here wouldn't leave. But she still wanted to give it a try. Maisie understood and suddenly remembered seeing a group of about 10 people on horseback carrying the banners of the church when she flew over a nearby city. Ashes let out a cold snort and said, "Apart from the border town, I don't think there's any other place nearby that would require the church to send an envoy. Their noses are as sensitive as dogs. Well, let them witness me cleanly defeat their knight. Then I'll tell them the news of the church's arrival. By then, Roland Wimbledon will know just how wrong he was." Above the border town, lightning soaring through the skies, while wearing a pair of wind goggles that Roland made for her, ensuring that no matter how fast she flew, the wind wouldn't sting her eyes. Lightning recalled Roland's comment about her resemblance to Ezreal, though she had no idea who Ezreal was. Suddenly, a white figure darted past the corner of her eye. She turned her head to see a pigeon spreading its wings and gliding through the sky. Pigeons were not uncommon birds, but this one was different. It was an incredibly plump, barbecue pigeon. Without hesitation, Lightning changed direction and charged toward the pigeon. The pigeon quickly noticed the unexpected pursuer and dove down, seemingly trying to escape into the nearby forest to shake off its relentless hunter. They raced through the woods and swiftly crossed an open clearing. Lightning seized the opportunity, pushed her speed to the limit, and in an instant, she pounced on the pigeon, pinning it to the ground. The pigeon struggled but couldn't break free from her grip. Lightning drew a small knife from her waist, ready to finish off her prey. But then, the pigeon unexpectedly spoke, "Don't. Help me, coo." The pigeon inflated into a ball and transformed into a human. Startled, Lightning was startled, nearly dropping her knife in fright. However, she quickly regained her composure. "You're a witch?" she asked. Maisie nodded repeatedly, confirming that she was indeed a witch. Lightning helped Maisie to her feet, and they introduced themselves to each other. Along the way, Maisie pointed to the pendant hanging around Lightning's neck. It was a tracking rune, used for locating purposes. Maisie appeared slightly annoyed because Lightning had just contemplated eating her. However, Maisie quickly explained that only witches could use the tracking rune, and it required a matching magic stone to pinpoint a specific location. Lightning's pendant was given to her by her father when she was a child. Within a few minutes, Lightning and Maisie seemed to have become the best of friends. They flew towards the mystery forest, gathering mushrooms and soaring above the castle. In the evenings, they studied together. As the days went by, the day of the duel drew closer. The weapons were still being improved, and Carter continued his training. He had become familiar with the handgun and was now able to hit the target consistently. On the eve of the duel, as the sky grew dark, Ash finally waited for Maisie to return to her room. Ash was busy cleaning her large blade when she asked Maisie why she had been returning so late in the past few days. Maisie transformed back into human form and pulled out a roasted bird leg from her pouch. The room was instantly filled with its irresistible aroma. It was a bird that Lightning and she had roasted together, and Maisie wanted to share it with Ash. Ash shook her head and was surprised to learn that Maisie also enjoyed eating birds. Maisie asked if the duel was really necessary. She knew that the witches here would never leave, and the border town is so comfortable that even she herself even wanted to stay. The prince would dine with the witches, laughing and joking together, and the people in the town didn't discriminate against witches. Plus, the witches here could play Gwent with her and keep her company. Most witches live in constant fear and uncertainty, and a stable and comfortable place to live is all they strive for. Take Maisie, for example. Before being accepted by Tilly, she had been hiding in a thatched hut in the slums of the capital city, curling up in the narrow gaps between the roof beams like a true bird, spending each night in fear. Even when Tilly decided to journey east across the sea, Maisie traveled tirelessly, reaching out to the hidden witches scattered throughout the land. Without any breaks, she had likely never experienced such a peaceful and tranquil life before, Ash thought to herself. Ashes couldn't fathom such thoughts. She was terrified, and there was no way she would leave Tilly's side. She confided in Maisie, revealing that this place was constantly under the looming threat of the church, unable to withstand the wrath of the God Punishment Army. The annihilation of the border town was merely a matter of time. What if they can resist? Maisie muttered under her breath. "I hope so too, which is why I'll help them prove it," Ashes said solemnly. The following day. Apart from Roland, the spectators included Axe, Brian, and all the members of the Witch Alliance. In addition, there was a fat pigeon perched on Roland's head. Carter was not dressed in his usual knight's armor but instead wore a fitted leather jacket for ease of movement. He had a specially customized gun holster around his waist, with a revolver tucked into each side. A short knife was also holstered at his lower back. Roland had Echo mimic and amplify his voice, saying, "The rules of the contest are simple, touch and stop, no headshots, and you can surrender. As long as you don't die on the spot, Manhwa's healing abilities can quickly heal you. Any questions?" He waited a moment, seeing no objections from the two, and continued, "When you hear the bell, the contest begins." Ashes, still dressed in her usual attire, wore a black robe that concealed her body. Her long black hair was tied back in a ponytail. Ashes silently assessed her opponent, Carter, the chief knight. However, he didn't carry the typical sword, shield, or spear, and he wasn't even wearing armor. The weapon in his hand was extremely peculiar, leaving only one possibility: it must be similar to a crossbow, a long-range weapon. Ashes had learned from numerous battles that a crossbow posed no threat to extraordinary witches. If it were a light crossbow, she could even catch the bolts with her bare hands. However, judging by the confident look on the prince's face, the weapon in his hand was definitely not as simple as a crossbow. Just then, a clear bell rang from the city walls. Almost simultaneously, Ashes made her move. Gripping the hilt of her sword with both hands, she forcefully lifted it forward, causing dirt, grass, and debris to fly into the air, creating a cloud of dust and sand in the direction of the knight. The chief knight's reaction was equally swift. His weapon burst into flames and emitted a deafening roar. Taking advantage of the cover provided by the dust and sand cloud, Ashes launched a sprint from the side. In the blink of an eye, the distance between them was reduced by half. However, Carter did not move from his position, completely disregarding the sand that had hit his face. Squinting his eyes, he aimed his weapon at the approaching extraordinary witch, once again pulling the trigger. With a thunderous boom accompanied by a burst of fire, Ashes reflexively took a step to the side. In the final moments, the remaining 10 steps were covered in the blink of an eye. She held her long sword upright in front of her and forcefully pushed off the ground with her feet, charging towards the knight like a bull. The third attack from Carter's gun detonated before Ash's eyes. She felt a powerful jolt through her sword, emitting a crisp buzzing sound, followed by a numbing sensation in her right abdomen as if something had viciously grabbed her. Almost simultaneously, she collided with Carter's chest, sending him flying in the air, tracing an arc before crashing to the ground. Only at this moment did she have the opportunity to examine the injury around her waist. However, as soon as she lowered her head, a strong dizziness surged to her brain. She staggered for a moment, nearly falling to the ground. The power that had flowed through her body seemed to have vanished like water, and her limbs became incredibly heavy. Ashes used her long sword to support her body. The numbness of the wound had transformed into an intense burning pain. It felt as if a part of her waist was missing, and she could even see her own vivid red organs. Only by gritting her teeth could she prevent herself from collapsing. Even though she was severely injured, she didn't faint. She stood on the field, displaying the terrifying resilience of an extraordinary witch. If it had been regular bullets or small-caliber rounds, she might have been able to endure them with her body alone. Maisie rushed to Ash's side as quickly as possible, wanting to support her, but due to her petite stature, she could only embrace Ash's legs, her face filled with anxiety. Manhwa was already attending to Carter's treatment, while Roland quickly approached Ashes, who was still holding on with the great effort. It seemed that she had been waiting for this moment. "I won," Ashes managed to say before collapsing onto Roland's shoulder. On a street, a woman bumped into a pedestrian. Someone forcefully pushed her, but she remained unmoved, instead watching as the person stumbled back 2 steps. The arrogant expression instantly disappeared from his face. After giving her a fierce glare, the person begrudgingly walked away. Most people frowned and avoided the woman in tattered clothes. And so, she slowly made her way to the entrance of the inner city gates of Grey Castle, the capital. Pedestrians were discussing the princess's coming-of-age ceremony, rumored to be attended by the archbishop as well. Ashes checked her dagger, which she carried with her. Suddenly, a thunderous cheer erupted from the crowd, interrupting her thoughts. She looked towards the inner city area where the kingdom's knight order was slowly approaching in a neat formation. The knights at the front were dressed immaculately, shining in golden armor. Royal descendants began to jump off the carriages one by one. Slowly walking towards the central podium were probably the 5 children of King Wellington III. Among these people, Ashes spotted Princess Tilly Wellington. There was no doubt that Princess Tilly was the protagonist of today. Her eyes sparkled with a lively light, as transparent as gemstones. Her simple side-parted bangs complemented her refreshing gray hair, devoid of any adornments. Her beauty stood out among her siblings. The patterns on her dress were not intricate but perfectly matched her demeanor. And most incredibly, she actually looked past the crowd and directly locked eyes with Ashes. Then, she nodded slightly as if greeting her, a smile appearing on her lips. It was definitely not an illusion. In that fleeting moment, Ashes felt the same sensation. It was an overwhelmingly familiar feeling, as if they had been friends for years, warm and sweet. It didn't come from blood ties, identity, or status, but from a resonance of magic. After the ceremony, 2 guards found her and escorted her to the palace. In a secluded chamber, she stood before Princess Tilly. After listening to Ash's experience, Princess Tilly gently touched her face and bestowed upon her the name Ashes, inviting her to follow her in the future. Ashes opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was Maisie's face. Maisie blinked her eyes and then hugged her tightly. Ashes tried moving her fingers and didn't feel the expected weakness or numbness. There was no sharp pain coming from her waist either. She lifted Maisie and knew that Manhwa had used her healing abilities to cure her. Ashes put on her black robe, glanced at the sky outside the window, and walked towards the door. In the office, Ashes saw Roland again. He was engrossed in writing, presumably dealing with governmental affairs. It wasn't until the prince set down his quill that Ashes spoke up. "I won." "Indeed, you won," Roland nodded. His straightforward attitude surprised her a little. She had expected Roland to be more argumentative, but he seemed to accept the outcome. Ashes acknowledged Roland's ability to fight off the God Punishment Army, and she was curious about the weapon Carter had used. Roland mentioned it was a semi-automatic pistol, and that his soldiers would be equipped with such weapons in the future. Even unarmed farmers could defeat a well-trained judgment soldier with a firearm. Ashes hesitated for a moment and asked if she could have one. "Only if you join the Witches' Alliance," Roland shrugged. "After all, these things are still very rare at the moment." Her refusal was expected, and Ashes had come to bid farewell. She intended to return to the fjord and informed Roland that he could seek refuge there as well. Roland smiled and told Ashes to convey the same message to his sister. The border town was also a place where witches could find sanctuary. Ashes smiled and said she would consider it. Just as she was about to leave the office, the prince called her back, wanting to give her a gift. She paused, turned around, and saw a massive sword placed by the door. It was a sword crafted by Anna, made of pure steel. The sword had a smooth and even surface, reflecting an orange-red metallic luster under the setting sun. Ashes walked closer, gently caressing the great sword. She liked it very much and, before leaving, she mentioned that she would give Roland a gift in return as a gesture of gratitude. A female knight came into the priest's tent. The knight remarked that they could obtain information by capturing and interrogating a few villagers from the border towns, without needing to see the Lord. Nyla smiled and replied, "Seeing the Lord is inevitable. If he truly harbors witches, he will be executed on the spot. But if the rumors are false, the church will continue to cooperate with him." Suddenly, a cry rang out, "Enemy attack!" The knight's tranquility shattered as the camp erupted in chaos. The female knight strode towards the front of the tent, only to be met with a thunderous blast. All the knights lay on the ground, while the female knight. Blood gushed into the air, illuminated by the flickering flames of the campfire. The female knight collapsed weakly to her knees, her body splitting apart and slowly falling to the sides, coming to rest at the feet of a woman. The priest trembled in fear, entire body shaking, while Ashes caught sight of a fallen book on the table, stirring painful memories of the past. She and those innocent little girls had all been deceived by that very book. With a mighty swing of her greatsword, she lunged toward the priest. Ashes buried the bodies, knowing that the secrets of the Witches' Alliance would eventually be exposed. However, this act bought them 2 or 3 months of time. Maisie caught the pigeons that connected the envoy and the church, and they roasted and ate them. This was a macabre gift from Ashes to Roland. There was one thing Ashes didn't mention. By doing this, she had essentially made the decision for the prince. When the church discovered the envoy's loss of contact, they would undoubtedly blame Roland. Even if he wanted to betray the witches, he wouldn't have the opportunity. With everything in order, the sky was gradually turning pale on the horizon. Ashes reached out and gently stroked Maisie's head, telling her that it was time to part ways here. Ashes knew Maisie loved this place, and Maisie lowered her head, showing a hesitant expression. She also loved Tilly and Ash. Ash smiled and assigned Maisie a task to fly back once a month and inform them of what was happening in the border town, while also bringing back news to the border town. This way, they could establish a connection between the two sides. If the town ever faced danger, Maisie could help them escape Greycastle and head to the fjord. Roland invited the Eltec couple to join him for dinner. Like her husband, Eileen had also become a teacher. After chatting for a while, Eileen cautiously asked why Roland had sought them out. In truth, Roland wanted an experienced person to come and perform in a play. Being on stage and acting had always been her dream. Roland handed over 3 scripts, one titled Cinderella, describing a touching love story between a common girl and a prince. Another called
Le coq chante à minuit,
which revolved around the rebellion of the lower-class people. And the last one titled Witch's Diary, an original work by Roland and Scroll that told the story of 3 girls who awakened witches and together overcame their enemies. The unexpected return of Maisie to the border town surprised everyone. Her return was warmly welcomed, and the Witch Alliance gained a new member. What deeply moved her was that the welcoming feast was held in the castle's backyard, where a long iron frame was adorned with a variety of meats, available for anyone to take and grill as they pleased. Maisie almost ate until she was stuffed before finally stopping. In the afternoon, Roland proceeded to test her abilities. Maisie's ability manifested as the power to transform into various birds, provided that she had seen them before. The transformation consumed a significant amount of magic, allowing her to change forms consecutively 4 to 5 times a day. She could transform into sparrows, seagulls, parrots, and many more. However, Roland noticed that regardless of the bird she transformed into, her size would increase significantly. Furthermore, there was one aspect of Ash's plan that caught Roland's attention. What abilities did the numerous witches gathered by Tilly possess? If there were witches who could significantly improve farming efficiency, he didn't mind exchanging technology with them. Thus, Roland decided to write a lengthy letter to Tilly. He would first elaborate on the Net-Ural alliance between their two sides, then caution her about the Church's desire to unify the continent. Expressing his willingness for mutual assistance, cooperation, and shared progress. He planned to have Maisie deliver the letter when she traveled to the fjord next month. In gratitude for Anna's tireless efforts over the past couple of weeks, Roland decided to give her a gift. He unveiled a burlap cloth, revealing a basket woven from vines in front of them. The top of the basket was connected to several hemp ropes, with a large canvas attached to the other end. As the balloon inflated completely and began to rise, the traction ropes slowly straightened. Roland was the first to flip into the basket, followed by Anna, who was climbing in. With a gentle sway, the hot air balloon lifted off the ground, gradually ascending. Before long, they had surpassed the top of the castle, and the panoramic view of the town unfolded before them. Looking down from here, one could clearly see the rooftops of the castle, the bustling town under construction, the flowing Crimson River from west to east, and the verdant farmland along the riverbanks. The way the border town looks now, it's all thanks to your efforts, Miss Anna. Upon hearing these words, Anna was stunned. After a moment, she leaned back and softly spoke, "My mother died in a fire, and instead of perishing in the smoke and flames, I became a witch. For a long time, I believed that it was my awakening that caused the fire, and I despised myself for being a witch. When I was locked in the dungeon, I thought it might bring me relief, but you rescued me and taught me how to harness my abilities. I never imagined that fire, apart from bringing destruction and pain, could have so many uses." Anna paused for a moment. "To have met you, I should have felt immensely content, but now I find that my thoughts have changed. Sometimes I feel a suffocating unease in my heart, longing for more." After the hot air balloon had stayed in the air for half an hour, it slowly descended into the castle courtyard. As soon as the prince climbed out of the basket, Scroll and Wendy immediately approached him, giving him a lecture and advising him not to take unnecessary risks. The prince made a couple of excuses before wisely changing the subject. The other witches also wanted to try the hot air balloon. Nightingale found it somewhat amusing and was about to join in when she suddenly froze in place. She saw Anna, carried out of the basket by Roland, with a twinkle in her eyes and a blush on her cheeks. The other witches clamored to ride in the hot air balloon as well. Soon enough, the balloon inflated again, and this time Anna and Manhwa soared into the sky. Nightingale stood on the outskirts of the crowd, gazing blankly as the hot air balloon became smaller and smaller. It was then that she realized why she had used her abilities in the courtyard. Glancing back at Wendy, who was looking around with a bewildered expression, Nightingale quickly walked away. After dinner, Nightingale returned to her bedroom, hugging her knees. Wendy entered the room and closed the door behind her. "I saw everyone riding in the hot air balloon, but you sat alone on the side," Wendy said. "It's nothing," Nightingale replied, turning over. Wendy sat on the edge of the bed, gently straightening her posture and staring at her for a while. "I thought you were willing to confide in me about anything," Wendy said. Nightingale didn't want to share all these troubles because it would make her feel selfish. After all, the first witch His Highness had met was Anna, not her. Whenever she felt lost, the first person she thought of was always Wendy, who would never let her down. With that in mind, she gently held Wendy's hand and briefly explained the situation. Nightingale repeated the question asked by Scroll that day, "His Highness Roland will marry a witch." Nightingale suddenly opened her eyes and said each word deliberately. He said it himself. And he wasn't lying. Wendy suddenly grabbed Nightingale's arm and earnestly told her that this matter should not be revealed to anyone, not even the sisters of the Witch Alliance. Nightingale was puzzled, and Wendy explained that Roland would undoubtedly become the king, and a king must have offspring. A king without an heir would not be accepted. Whether Roland could become the king would determine the fate of all the witch sisters. Wendy pondered for a moment and asked Nightingale if she wanted to become the queen or continue guarding by Roland's side. Without hesitation, Nightingale replied that she naturally wanted to be by his side. Wendy smiled and said, "There can only be one queen, but even if he ascends the throne, he still needs your protection. Do you understand what I mean?" Nightingale blinked her eyes but did not answer. The secret chamber of the Hermes Grand Cathedral. The ritual of divine punishment transformation is the knowledge that the Pope must possess. When Maine took over the Codex of Divine Punishment a year ago, it was equivalent to obtaining the qualification to be the next Pope. The two judgment soldiers lay on the transformation platform, and Maine recognized them. The guards came forward and blindfolded the two soldiers, securing their limbs firmly to the platform with wrist and ankle restraints. Then a witch was brought in and laid flat between the two soldiers. One succeeded, and one failed. Standing between the two transformation platforms was the highest leader of the church, Pope Oberlin. He wore a striking red robe with gold trim and a sparkling gemstone crown on his head. Maine hesitated for a moment and asked how many judgment soldiers they would need to defeat the demons. Pope Oberlin raised his hand to silence him, telling Maine that he was too impatient. As the next pope, all the questions would be answered in the hidden chamber at the top of the Holy Secretariat. For now, the more God judgment soldiers, the better. Soon, another muscular warrior prepared for the ritual. It was Tak Thor, a member of the Holy City Guards, who knelt on one knee, feeling immensely honored to participate in this ceremony. Simultaneously, a God punishment knight approached, cradling an 18-year-old witch raised by the church. The day before the sacrifice, she had been heavily sedated with copious amounts of dreamer's water, a potent sleeping potion. Shortly after, a delicate silver needle was carefully inserted into the witch's arm, and the reddish-brown fluid flowed through the tube encasing the needle, converging into a crystal basin below her. At the bottom of the basin lay a layer of pale blue God punishment stones, gradually being submerged by the crimson fluid until the entire basin was filled. Soon, the God punishment stones began to undergo a transformation. Looking through one side of the basin, one could witness the blue stones absorbing the blood. After approximately half an hour, the stones gradually melted away, leaving the once murky blood clear and transparent, changing its color from reddish-brown to sky blue. The witch's body had been magically altered, imbuing her blood with enhanced organ and tendon capabilities. However, if this blood were used directly, it would instantly kill the recipient. Hence, the need for the God punishment stones to neutralize its effects before injecting it into the subjects undergoing conversion. Even so, this blood still damaged the recipient's consciousness, gradually eroding their emotions and intelligence, leaving behind only instincts and remnants of strong will. The surviving God Punishment Knights would possess enhancements comparable to ordinary individuals and would also possess anti-magic properties when not wearing the God Punishment Stones. As the blue liquid flowed slowly into the body of the Judgment Knights through the tubing, the veins in his arms and neck bulged, and his expressions contorted in a grimace, as if enduring immense pain. With the completion of the ritual, Maine could barely remain standing. He stumbled off the platform, awkwardly leaning against the wall of the Grand Hall. Tak had succeeded, becoming the 62nd God Punishment Knight of the year. Before Maine left, Pope Oberlin entrusted him with the latest development, a newly developed poison that, when sprinkled on decaying corpses, would have a long-lasting effect on the surrounding population, eliminating the need for direct ingestion like conventional poisons. Without a specific antidote, it was virtually incurable. In the forthcoming battles against the Four Kingdoms, it might prove to be a useful asset. Today, Anna and Soraya sat atop a hot air balloon, marveling at the scenery below. The basket they sat in was adorned with paintings, depicting an aerial view of the border town. However, unlike the previous photorealistic style, this time her paintings seemed to come alive, almost standing upright. Upon their return to the castle, Roland immediately summoned Soraya, and Nightingale confirmed the observation. Soraya's magic core has transformed, and the golden vortex of magical energy within Soraya's body had transformed. It had condensed into a continuously swirling ribbon. Soraya's painting had become more substantial and more vivid. The trees she painted appeared to be over a dozen centimeters thick. Soraya's abilities had evolved, giving her a different perspective on her paintings. Roland thought the painting was more than just pigment, it seemed to be a coating composed of magic. Perhaps it could be applied to other things as well. Back in his office, Roland embarked on his new plan. He intended to use a steam engine to pump water from the Crimson Water River into the water tower and then utilize the principle of siphoning to distribute it through a pipeline to every household, creating an automated water supply system. Lately, Roland felt that Nightingale had been growing distant from him. He called her name a couple of times in the office, but there was no response. Suddenly, an evil grin appeared on his face as he reached for the snacks inside his desk. However, Nightingale intervened, stopping him in his tracks. Seeing Nightingale still by his side, Roland smiled and expressed his gratitude for her unwavering protection and companionship. Nightingale discovered a silver handgun in one of the drawers. The pistol gleamed with a polished surface, reflecting shadows, and both the handle and the barrel were adorned with exquisite engravings. The name to Veronica was inscribed on the barrel. This plan had been brewing in Roland's mind for a long time. Compared to the cumbersome and inconvenient muzzle-loading firearms, the newly developed revolver was considerably more refined. It maintained high levels of both safety and firing rate. With Nightingale's exceptional agility as a witch, one could only anticipate the power she could unleash with a firearm in her hands. Nightingale possessed great talent, quickly familiarizing herself with the handgun and exhibiting remarkable accuracy in hitting her targets. Suddenly, Roland patted Nightingale's shoulder and told her to remember to pull the trigger while shouting, "It's high noon." Nightingale glanced at Roland and asked if it was necessary or simply his personal preference. She raised the handgun, took a deep breath, and effortlessly hit the bullseye. At that moment, she found her answer. She was his shield and his blade, guarding him by his side until the very end of her life, fearless and without regrets. The highly anticipated premiere of the play was fast approaching. As the Lord, Roland naturally had the best seat in the house. In the direction directly facing the stage, Carl had constructed a temporary wooden platform with 3 tiers, accommodating approximately 100 people. Roland sat right in the middle of the 3rd tier. On one side of him were the members of the Witch Alliance, with Anna seated right beside him, while on the other side were the representatives of the Merchant Guild, with Margaret being the closest. A chubby merchant named Hogg, who had already devoured his 10th giant dumplings, asked Roland if he could sell him the recipe. Another merchant held a mug in his hand, appreciating its elegant design and waterproof coating. He didn't want the regular fragile crystal cups and expressed his interest in purchasing some. Meanwhile, Lightning and Macy were competing for popcorn in the sky. Soon, everyone quieted down. There was no curtain, no opening speech. Only a wooden board separated the front stage from the backstage area. A group of people were about to perform a play on such a rudimentary stage. It was their first official performance in their lives. The story takes place in the capital of a kingdom, in the outskirts of the city, where a beautiful and kind-hearted girl resides. As the narrator's voice echoed, Eileen slowly walked onto the stage. She was dressed in a dirty gray robe, her hair unkempt and disheveled, and her face smudged with black ash. Swinging the broom in her hand, she meticulously swept the floor, occasionally bending down to wipe away stubborn stains with the edge of her robe. However, what Eileen never expected was that May had actually given up the leading role to her. May was the star of the Western Star Fortress Theater and a prominent figure in the troupe. At that moment, May made her entrance. This scene depicted the initial conflict between the wicked stepsisters and Cinderella. Under the sisters' bullying and humiliation, Cinderella could only respond with tears, hiding in the basement and silently crying in front of her mother's portrait. May's elevated demeanor, precise movements, and unhidden contempt in her eyes overwhelmed Eileen with a strong sense of oppression. May forcefully pushed her, and Eileen was supposed to pretend to fall. However, under May's icy gaze, she involuntarily took a few steps back and tripped over herself, falling to the ground with little cushioning. Her elbow collided with the stage floor, sending a sharp and burning pain through her arm. May's gaze no longer lingered on her. She walked to the center of the stage, facing the silent audience in the square, and began her monologue. May was too convincing. Her disgust and disdain towards Eileen felt all too real. Even sitting here, one could sense her cold and heartless demeanor. Eileen was somewhat stunned. May's exquisite acting captured everyone's attention, but Eileen hadn't fully immersed herself in the performance. It wasn't until May finished her act and passed by her, with the flowing hem of her dress brushing against Eileen's face, that she snapped back to reality. The next scene began. Cinderella's stepsisters were going to attend the prince's banquet that night, while Cinderella was trapped in the basement, clad in dirty rags and without even a pair of shoes. Suddenly, smoke filled the stage, and a young girl emerged from it, introducing herself as a witch from the Witch Alliance. The audience displayed various expressions of surprise upon seeing the witch. The little witch was here to help the kind-hearted Cinderella. This was Roland's plan to adapt the original story, promoting the kindness of the Witch Alliance and subtly guiding the people to eliminate their prejudices against witches. Manhwa's portrayal of the little witch was the perfect choice since she had already become an idol-level figure in the First Army. With a wave of her hand, the little witch conjured up a carriage and a set of exquisite evening gowns. The little witch informed Cinderella that the witch's magic could only last until midnight. The next scene began. The handsome prince strolled down the street, feeling bored with the royal banquet. The actor playing the prince was indeed handsome, but his expression seemed too rigid. Margaret commented on this, and Roland chuckled. Next, the prince and Cinderella danced together on stage. Suddenly, the chimes rang, and Cinderella quickly let go of the prince's hand and hurriedly made her way down to the stage. In her haste, she dropped her glass slipper. The prince searched from house to house in the outer city, finally arriving at Cinderella's home. The story had a happy ending. The atmosphere in the entire venue instantly exploded. Everyone erupted in excitement as they witnessed the embrace between the prince and Cinderella. Timely cannon fire sounded from outside the stage, elevating the atmosphere to its peak. The applause and cheers continued incessantly, merging into a harmonious symphony of celebration. The actors bowed and exited the stage as the final narration echoed, yet the applause from the audience showed no signs of stopping. Taking a deep breath, May changed her clothes and, with a stern face, was the first to leave the dressing room. Just as she descended the wooden stairs, a man suddenly approached her. He, too, had a tall and handsome stature, adorned in shining silver armor. He appeared to be a knight from the border town. Carrying a bouquet of flowers, the man introduced himself and praised May's performance, hoping to invite her for a drink. Meanwhile, in the Changgu stronghold, approximately 50 individuals approached, all dressed in armor, glistening under the midnight. Among the 8 groups, 4 of them carried banners. 3 of these banners bore the emblem of the Twin Towers, symbolizing the Grey Castle royal family, while the other banner displayed a horse head, which Petrov recognized as the insignia of the House of Or, from the Northern Territory. A man stepped forward from the ranks of the knights. It was Raymond, the envoy of King Timothy. Petrov took a deep breath, realizing what was going on. Since the other party was not an impostor, he had no reason to turn away the envoy of the new king, as doing so would be tantamount to making an enemy of the Grey Castle. Of course, this news needed to be promptly conveyed to His Highness Roland. He dispatched his knights to the border town and ordered the gates to be opened. Standing at the city gates, he noticed that aside from the spirited 10 or so individuals at the forefront of the group, the rest of the knights seemed worn out. They slouched on their horses, appearing as if they could collapse at any moment. The envoy's entourage was nothing more than a ruse. Among the 50-person group, there were only 13 true knights. The rest were mercenaries disguised as knights, under the influence of church pills, now more obedient than hounds and more ferocious than demons. This was the key to Raymond seizing control of the city gates. The following day, in the border town, the backyard water tank was already filled with water, and he turned on the tap, allowing the water to flow through the pipes. Roland introduced the faucet, explaining that they no longer needed to fetch water from the well and could now take baths every day. Lightning stuck out his tongue and licked the never-ending droplets of water. "It tastes quite sweet," she remarked. Maisie stuck her head out from under Lightning and followed suit. "It's pretty sweet, cool." Manhwa tried to bring her head closer, but Roland stopped her and explained that the water must be boiled before drinking. "So, you spent a whole week in the castle just to make bathing more comfortable?" Lily sneered and whispered, "Truly a noble who enjoys extravagance." Scroll intervened to stop Lily, but Roland waved his hand, indicating that he didn't mind. Shortly after the prince returned to his office, Scroll followed suit. She apologized once again, and Roland smiled, assuring her that he didn't mind at all. Scroll recounted Lily's story, explaining that she no longer easily trusted others after being deceived. Scroll also had the ability to sense magic, so she would disguise itself as a noblewoman wanting to adopt a child whenever passing through a town. At that time, Lily was locked up in a remote shelter, but when Scroll specifically requested to adopt her, they refused, stating that they only sold adult girls at that establishment. She grew suspicious and had Nightingale examine the account books in this place. It was discovered that in the past decade, a total of 3 witches had been found in the shelter, all of whom were sold to the church. Those with attractive appearances were sold to nobles, while those who went unnoticed were killed in the shelter's woods. However, when they attempted to disperse this group of girls, most of the people glared at them with anger, as if they had taken away their chance of being adopted by nobles. Lily was initially the same until Hakarat took her on a trip to the woods behind the small building. There, she witnessed her friend who had falsely claimed to be chosen by a noble and left the shelter a month ago, as well as several putrid pits. From that point on, she became wary and mistrustful of ordinary people, especially nobles. Roland felt a deep sense of regret in his heart, vowing never to let the country he ruled become like this. Scroll remained silent for a long time before finally speaking up and asking Roland a question. Her expression turned serious, and she looked up, glancing to the side, asking if Nightingale was present as well. Nightingale materialized, asking if she should leave. Scroll shook her head, and then she turned its gaze toward Prince Roland. It brought up Roland's statement earlier about wanting to marry a witch, but Scroll wanted to make it clear to Roland that witches cannot bear children. She wanted to know if even knowing this, if he would change his mind. Roland hadn't anticipated that witches would be so concerned about his marriage. He asked Scroll if the inability of witches to bear children might be due to some misconceptions. Scroll sighed, regretfully confirming that many examples had proven this point. Whether in normal relationships with ordinary people or under coercion, there were no instances of witches being able to have children. In Roland's mind, he wondered if it was because witches had surpassed ordinary humans, making it impossible for them to conceive offspring with ordinary people. However, now was not the time for delving into the root cause. The key was the impact it would have on his desire to marry a witch. The first person he thought of was Anna. Though it was somewhat regrettable that he couldn't have children with her, his love for her was not dependent on having children. Furthermore, as someone with a modern soul, the importance of bloodline inheritance, emphasized by ancient people, was not as significant to him. As an individual with his own separate life, he didn't consider children as an extension of himself. Emotionally, he could fully accept the fact that witches couldn't bear children. The only remaining obstacle was the practical issue of an heir. However, for Roland, who had a broad perspective on history, this was not a particularly difficult matter. He simply needed to establish a democratic empire that didn't rely on having an heir. There were many options for implementing this, and he could consider them at a later time. Perhaps Roland had been lost in his thoughts for too long, as Nightingale couldn't help but grab his arm. Roland snapped out of his reverie and comfortingly patted her hand. He cleared his throat and said, "I thought this way before, and I still think so now." He coughed twice and continued, "I still think so now. I am willing to marry a witch." The expression on Scroll's face, as she departed, was strange, a mix of contentment and a hint of sadness, leaving Roland puzzled. He turned to Nightingale beside him and inquired, but she only smiled and turned away, keeping her back to Roland. Just then, there was a knock on the office door. Carter entered, bringing news that the Chengdu stronghold had been occupied and Petrov had been captured. Timothy's envoy had successfully breached the cathedral of Changji stronghold. The soldier's eyes glowed crimson, having consumed the drugs given by the church. The leading knight swiftly dispatched the priest with a single stroke. In the basement, they discovered 4 large chests filled with thousands of pills. The knight in charge proclaimed that it would be enough to eliminate Roland. In the border town, Roland initially considered disregarding the matter since a mere 50-person group posed no threat to the border town. He reasoned that allowing only the leader to enter for negotiations would suffice. However, considering Petrov's cautious approach, he deemed it better to keep track of the envoy's movements. With this in mind, he summoned Lightning and Maisie, instructing them to fly to the stronghold and assess the situation along the way. After an hour had passed, the 2 witches completed their reconnaissance and returned to the castle. They discovered that over 1,000 people had departed from Changji stronghold, far surpassing the 50-person envoy. However, only 6 of them seemed riding on horses, while the majority of the remaining infantry lacked proper armor and wielded an assortment of weapons. If Timothy intended to resolve the situation by force, it would be impossible for them to overlook the battle that had erupted between Changji stronghold and the border town. Duke Ryan's coalition of over 200 knights couldn't even reach the outskirts of the town, let alone these militias without proper equipment and horses. Knowing the course and outcome of the battle, and still advancing towards the town, it could only mean that they were confident in breaking through the town's defenses. Roland couldn't help but think of the church's pills. He had previously speculated whether the church, while supporting himself and Garcia, had also extended its support to Timothy. If these people possessed the pills, the situation would be entirely different. It could enhance the running speed of humans to that of horses within a short period of time, while also eliminating the fear of pain. In other words, the line of defense would face the charge of over 1,000 painless knights, and if even one person managed to break into their defense, it would result in casualties for the First Army. Roland instructed Lightning and Maisie to bring Nightingale with them to keep watch, but requested that they observe from a distance. Just as the 3 of them were preparing to leave, Roland stopped them and emphasized the importance of protecting themselves. After the witches departed, he felt a slight unease, realizing a significant mistake he had made in his work. His control over the intelligence regarding Changji stronghold was too weak. If it weren't for Petrov's dispatching messengers, Roland might have found himself in a situation where the enemy was at his doorstep before he even noticed. Once engaged in hand-to-hand warfare, it would be devastating for the First Army. "I'm still too young, too naive," Roland thought. He reflected that after the war he need to work on his intel, as well as he should also place his own personnel around Petrov. Anna interjected, informing Roland that it wasn't the time to lament. The army of 1,000 people would take at least 3 days to arrive, and the border town still needed Roland's command. She comforted Roland, telling him no matter what happens, they will always be on his side. At the outskirts of the town, Roland received accurate information that the majority of the enemy did not possess the God Punishment Stone. He stood atop a hill, observing hundreds of people digging several large pits on the ground. Curious, Lightning asked what these pits were for. Roland replied that they were constructing bunkers. Brick walls would be built around these holes, leaving a gap for the musketeers to fire from within. Behind them, a defensive line would be formed, consisting of cannons. The artillery units had increased from 4 to 20 groups, with each group equipped with a 12-pound field cannon. The latest field cannons had an effective range of over a kilometer. Roland quickly formulated a preliminary battle plan in his mind. With a smile, he said to the witches, "If you want to eat something, go to the cafeteria and tell the chef." Maisie and Lightning happily dashed toward the cafeteria. Nightingale held Anna's hand and informed her that when the enemy attacked, she hoped Anna would take over the duty of guarding His Highness and protecting him. Nightingale had to carry out a special mission. Anna glanced at Nightingale for a moment and nodded. Shortly after, the two of them then made their way towards the cafeteria. 3 days quickly passed, and the defense line was nearly complete. The enemy force of 1,000 men advanced toward the border town. 2 leading knights looked disdainfully at the militia behind them. These militia members had not received specialized training and relied solely on pills provided by the church to be of any use. One of the knights sighed, wondering why they had trained in martial arts from a young age when now, even unarmed farmers could join the battlefield by taking a pill. The knight's words furrowed Raymond's brow, but it wasn't the time to dwell on such matters. In the forest through which the enemy passed, Nightingale's figure emerged. The scout in the vanguard reported that they had discovered the town's military forces up ahead. Raymond took a look through his telescope. According to the information gathered from the wolf and elk families, they primarily relied on a long-range weapon to counter the knight's charges. This weapon could launch an attack before the knights reached their top speed, accompanied by flashes and deafening sounds. It resembled a large crossbow but shot projectiles much faster than arrows. The other knight quickly grasped the key point that although these weapons had tremendous power, they couldn't fire continuously. Raymond nodded. He knew that these 1,500 peasants who had taken the pills could run as fast as horses, and by relying on a swarm tactic, they could swiftly break through the defense line and capture the border town in one fell swoop. Just as Raymond was preparing to give the order to adjust the formation, the corner of his eye caught a glimpse of a white figure. He froze, tilting his head as if he heard, "Are you sure?" He looked at the knight beside him, then glanced around, feeling that he might be hallucinating. He raised his long sword, preparing to order the troops to form a sudden formation, but then, among the militia, Echo appeared, mimicking Raymond's voice, shouting, "Swallow the pills and charge." In an instant, 1,500 people swallowed the pills without hesitation. Raymond angrily stared at the other knight, thinking he was behind this trickery. Suddenly, Nightingale emerged from behind him, holding a silver revolver in her hand. She said, "It's high noon." Raymond felt as if his head had been struck by an iron hammer, and the world spun as darkness engulfed him. The other knight stared blankly at Raymond, who had fallen from his horse. The back of his head had completely exploded, revealing a mixture of red and white gush. Then he heard his own voice ringing out. It shouted, "Charge, everyone!" No, he hadn't spoken at all. He covered his mouth and looked behind him. The militia members were eagerly swallowing the pills and charging forward, callously trampling over Raymond's lifeless body as if a human wall was surging toward him. It was the witch, he realized. The witch had imitated his voice. He commanded everyone to stop, but his voice was like a tiny splash in the surging crowd. The rampaged militia had lost all rationality, and some of them were even charging toward him. The situation had completely spiraled out of control. No matter how loudly he shouted, his voice was drowned out by the fervent roars of the crowd. He swung his weapon at the nearest militia member. He surveyed his surroundings, determined to find the witch responsible for this chaos. The battle had commenced, and 20 cannons erupted in unison. Even when struck by bullets, the medicated militia soldiers, their limbs shattered by exploding shells, continued their charge. They swiftly advanced towards the forefront bunkers, with Brian peering through a firing window, observing the encroaching enemy. Gunfire resonated from the leading bunkers as the enemy drew nearer. Prior to the battle, the First Army had been informed that the adversaries were deranged individuals who had ingested church-induced pills. Therefore, the sight of the enemy relentlessly charging through the hail of bullets did not daunt the soldiers. Instead, it ignited their fighting spirit, as the First Army had grown accustomed to confronting such monstrous creatures. The enemy soon closed in within 150 meters. Brian took a deep breath and exclaimed, "Open fire!" The soldiers had eagerly awaited this command, and they wasted no time in pulling their triggers at the carefully aimed targets. In an instant, the bunker was filled with the symphony of gunfire. The first adversaries to cross the firing line were struck by the crisscrossing bullets from both sides, their blood spilling from their waists as they staggered a couple of steps before collapsing to the ground. Brian noticed several individuals attempting to scale the top of the frontline bunker, intending to launch a surprise attack on the soldiers inside. However, they were thwarted by the enclosed bunker that blocked their entry. Without hesitation, Brian redirected his aim and systematically dispatched each exposed assailant. Suddenly, he shouted, "Take cover," as the enemies behind them hurled dozens of spears. However, the bunker intercepted every projectile. One of the fresh recruits chuckled, assuming there was no danger, and stood up. Yet, a spear, perfectly aimed, pierced through the firing window and impaled his chest. Emitting a muffled groan, he collapsed to the ground. Brian quickly began examining his injuries. The wounded soldier's consciousness remained relatively clear as he trembled, anxiously asking if he was going to die. The short spear had slanted into his lower chest, slightly missing his lungs, as his breathing appeared relatively unobstructed. Brian recalled Roland's advice not to remove the spear in such situations, but rather wait for Manhwa to treat it after the battle. Placing his hand on the soldier's forehead, Brian asked if he knew about Manhwa's abilities. The soldier managed a weak smile and expressed his gratitude for finally having the chance to meet Miss Manhwa. Brian firmly clasped his hand, urging him to hold on. After finishing his words, Brian returned to the firing window, while Roland stood on the elevated platform, providing a clear view of the enemy surging towards the town like a tidal wave. With each row of bunkers they crossed, their speed noticeably decreased. By the time they reached the third row of bunkers, the flanks of the enemy were fully exposed to the crossfire of the musketeers. Soon, the enemy breached the 300 meters range, entering the deadly zone covered by the artillery positions, a zone where shotgun pellets reigned supreme. Vayner commanded the cannons to fire, adjusting their angles to flatten the trajectory. Flames and thick smoke erupted from the cannons, and the devastating impact of the shotgun pellets on unarmored targets was evident, with each ion pellet capable of piercing through 2 to 3 individuals. While the pills provided some resistance to pain, they couldn't suppress the innate fear. Witnessing their comrades being turned into sieves, even the overwhelming excitement and thirst for bloodlust couldn't suppress the instinctual fear of their own lives. As half of their forces lay strewn across the assault path, the enemy began to show signs of retreat. Fear spread like a plague, infecting the militia, who dropped their weapons and fled toward the rear. The leading cavalryman ordered them to come back, but soon enough, a high-velocity artillery shell landed on his head. Roland, observing from the walls, saw the deserters and knew they were never truly a resolute unit. Without the pills, they were just a group of untrained civilians lacking practical combat experience. He hammered the wall in frustration, gritting his teeth. Damning Timothy for utilizing the civilian. The wounded on the defensive line immediately received medical treatment. Manhwa had been stationed at the rear of the defense line, ready to provide aid, especially when the enemy turned to retreat. Disregarding the thunderous sound of cannons, she rushed towards the artillery positions with viscount Pine, tending to the injured struck by the short spears. It was hard to imagine that half a year ago, she would faint at the sight of blood. Throughout the entire battle, only 5 individuals were wounded, all from spear throwers, and miraculously, all 5 survived. Amidst cheers, many soldiers saluted her, watching her depart the battlefield. Levin's blazing anger gradually cooled, replaced by a growing sense of fear. His few remaining cavalrymen pursued Nightingale, and he ordered them to consume the pills and find her. Suddenly, 2 massive vines descended from above, ensnaring the 2 cavalrymen. At that moment, the sound of footsteps trampling through the undergrowth echoed behind him. Expressionless, a woman in white approached, standing atop a horse. A frigid weapon pressed against his forehead. From this angle, Levin caught a glimpse of the face hidden beneath the hood. A demon? No, was this the witch? She is remarkably beautiful. Before the gunshot rang out, this was his final thought. The sun had yet to set, but the war had already come to an end. In fact, this battle was much easier than dealing with the Duke's coalition. No, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Considering the effects of the pills, Roland didn't immediately order the First Army to pursue the enemy. Instead, he dispatched Lightning and Macy to scout. Without the pills, the addicted militia members deteriorated rapidly, and they were quickly caught up by the pursuing forces. The pursuit units swiftly gathered them all and escorted them to the Changji stronghold. Based on the information obtained from interrogating surrendered knights, Nightingale effortlessly dismantled the remaining garrison at the stronghold. The captain was shot on the spot. It took 4 days to reach the Changgu stronghold. In the castle dungeon, Roland's subordinates found Petrov, who appeared somewhat weary. However, considering his Count Noble status, he hadn't suffered any inhumane treatment. After nearly 3 months, the prince met with this representative once again. To prevent a recurrence of the stronghold falling, Roland immediately devised new plans, forming an army, constructing roads, and promoting education. He detailed everything on paper and demanded that Petrov put them into action immediately. Petrov assured him that he wouldn't disappoint Roland again. Next, he asked about how to handle the prisoners. Roland pondered for a moment, sighed, and said to keep them alive. They wouldn't survive for much longer anyway. The Church's secret pills, which was also Timothy's objective, could temporarily unleash extraordinary power in ordinary people. However, once the drug's effects wore off, the users would gradually weaken and die. Boarding the little township, the prince embarked on his journey back. He stood at the bow of the ship, appearing troubled. Nightingale materialized beside him and asked, "Is it because of those civilians?" Roland sighed, gripping the wooden railing tightly. He knew they were all forced by Timothy. If they hadn't taken the Church's pills and been manipulated, they wouldn't have acted as pawns for the enemy, dying in this unfamiliar land. Nightingale reached out and held his arm, comforting him. She said, "It's not your fault." Roland didn't hesitate to respond, knowing that it wasn't his fault. If Roland hadn't stopped them, the small town would have become a sacrifice to Timothy's lust for power. Everyone would have been killed: soldiers, residents, witches. Of course, the Church, the creator of the pills, was also one of the main culprits. Nightingale looked at Roland and said, "So, you will destroy the Church, put an end to the conflict, and ensure that people no longer have to kill each other for senseless reasons. Under your rule, regardless of their identity or status, whether they are ordinary people or witches, they can all live happily. Is that correct?" Roland looked into her sparkling eyes and nodded gently, "Yes, I promise." The ocean was like a vast expanse of azure land, only smoother. If Maisie were here, she would have chattered away, reporting how far they were from the islands. But now, all she could hear were the rhythmic sounds of the waves lapping against the ship's hull. Although it grew tedious after a while, for the crew, it was a fortunate rhythm, signifying good weather for sailing. An elderly man with speckled white hair approached her. It was surprising that they had truly settled on Slumbering Isle, despite its large land area. However, when the tide rose, most of the land would be submerged, making it unsuitable for habitation. He questioned why they didn't settle in Crescent Bay instead. It was the second largest island and still had plenty of uninhabited land. Ash chuckled. Not everyone is willing to deal with witches. Jack One-Eye was the captain of this ship, just as his name suggested. His face was adorned with an eye patch, concealing his left eye completely. He was one of the few captains who were willing to transport supplies for the witches. Ash was well aware that Slumbering Isle would be engulfed by the sea. It was precisely because of this that it remained an uninhabited island. Witches, being adept at manipulating nature, had the power to transform the island into their own sanctuary. She looked up at the sky and remarked, without the suppression of the church, they could create a completely different world, a brand new world. Ash changed the subject and asked the captain how long it had been since he last visited Slumbering Isle. Jack replied, "It's been about a month." He scratched the back of his head, recalling the playful antics of the beautiful and young girls on his ship, which had left his crew dumbfounded. Just then, a sailor raised his binoculars and spotted an island ahead. He immediately reported to the captain. Jack, initially skeptical, ascended the crow's nest and raised his own binoculars. To his astonishment, it was indeed Slumbering Isle, but it had changed. The entire ship's crew could hardly believe their eyes. The towering island rose above the sea level like a small mountain, with sheer and steep cliffs that extended for several yards to the summit. The witches on the island were going about their daily lives when one of them, with green hair, seemed to sense something. The witch beside her asked what was wrong. She tucked her hair behind her ear and said, "She's back." A young girl stood at the edge of the dock, ready to greet Ash. She lowered her head and greeted Ash with a curtsy. Ash gently patted the girl's head and chuckled, "No need for such formality." Captain Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. He never expected that they could make an entire island rise. Captain Jack muttered, "No wonder those church folks treat witches like demons. This is almost godlike." Little Molly interjected, "It didn't rise. We built a wall around the island." Though Molly had a petite figure, she was the main force behind the logistics of the entire Slumbering Isle. She could summon a massive blue slime that could carry several tons of cargo at once. Captain Jack looked disdainfully at the crew behind him and told them that not a single one of them could match the abilities of a young girl. He walked towards the center of the island, where various houses had been constructed. These buildings were unlike the typical wooden or stone houses. They seemed to have emerged from the depths of the earth with their foundations seamlessly integrated into the ground. The island had two docks, one built at sea level and the other suspended in midair. During high tide, the aerial dock aligned perfectly with the sea surface, and during low tide, it returned to the surface. Molly pointed towards the northernmost house and informed Ash that it was Queen Tilly's palace. Ash nodded, bidding farewell to the two before walking briskly toward the north. The creator of this new home was Tilly Wimbledon, the Witch Queen. Unlike royal palaces, this spacious house had no guards or locked doors. Ash walked through the courtyard and entered the grand hall, only to see a familiar figure with brown hair standing before her. She silently approached from behind and covered the brown-haired woman's eyes with her hand. "I'm back, Tilly," she said softly. Tilly wore a brown silk glove with a sparkling ruby embedded on the back of the hand. She explained that the magical gemstone altered the way magic operated. Tilly removed the glove and handed it to Ash, instructing her to imagine magic as something tangible and then release it through the stone. Deep in thought, Ash pondered for a while but failed to produce even a spark of electricity. Tilly had previously tested many individuals and found that out of 100 people, only 2 or 3 could quickly comprehend and unleash lightning through the stone. This raised a question in Tilly's mind: what exactly was magic? The abilities of witches varied greatly, but if the same abilities could be replicated using these stones, she was uncertain whether magic was artificial or naturally occurring. It was said that these magic stones were discovered in ancient ruins. There was a ruin rumored to be located in the eastern forest near Sea Peak County. Tilly expressed her desire to visit it personally. However, Ash interrupted, saying that it is one of the most dangerous places in Grey Castle. She had heard that Garcia's black sail fleet had set sail with the purpose of reaching CP County, which happened to be Timothy's territory. Ash suspected that Garcia intended to use his fleet to initiate a large-scale war. Tilly's expression grew concerned. If the internal conflict continued, the church would take advantage of the situation and Grey Castle would suffer the same fate as the kingdom of Yeongdong, being swallowed by the church. This statement left Ash momentarily stunned, as if she saw the image of Roland. Tilly quickly noticed her unusual reaction and asked what was wrong. Ash rubbed her forehead and explained that Tilly's demeanor just now resembled that of Roland Wimbledon, as Roland had uttered the same words. Tilly became intrigued, surprised that Ash had encountered him. Tilly expressed her curiosity and wanted to know what Ash had gained from their encounter. Upon hearing Ash's account, Tilly pondered for a moment before speaking up. This person isn't Roland Wimbledon. He has been replaced. Ash was taken aback by this revelation. Tilly squinted her eyes, knowing that Roland had gathered a significant number of witches around him. She suspected that one of the witches had taken control of him and assumed his appearance. Having grown up alongside Roland, Tilly knew him better than anyone. Roland was a person who willingly embraced debauchery, lacked ambition, had a penchant for women, and was both sleazy and detestable. His lies were always full of loopholes. Ash raised an eyebrow at Tilly's response, surprised by her remark about how Roland was perceived in Tilly's mind. Tilly sighed and admitted that despite everything, she still needed to establish contact with the Witch Alliance in the border town. After all, Roland was her brother, and even though his character was flawed, he wasn't irredeemable at his core. Compared to the other princes and princesses, he was the least harmful. Ash couldn't help but think of Wendy and the witches in the border town. She believed that those witches wouldn't resort to such actions. Furthermore, she had left Maisie there, and by the end of the month, she would bring back more news from Bordertown for Slumbering Isle. Tilly stood up and looked at Ash. Now that Ash had returned, it was time to move on to the next phase of their plan, the cleansing operation. Tilly issued the command, declaring that there should be no trace of the church remaining in the bay. Ultimately, all the islands in the bay would become a haven for the witches. After repelling Timothy's forces, the border town returned to tranquility. Scroll held a mirror in her hands, and it was the first time she saw her own reflection so clearly. Every witch had tried the mercury-coated mirror, which Soraya had simulated from the laboratory. She applied a bright coating directly to the glass using her ability, mimicking the effect of a mercury mirror while eliminating the risk of mercury vapor poisoning. Soraya said it was Prince Roland's idea, as it would make it more convenient for the witches. Ever since he learned about Soraya's evolution, he had been planning to create a microscope that could observe cellular structures. If they could witness the marvelous microscopic world firsthand, it might trigger the evolution of new abilities in the witches or, at the very least, ignite their interest in learning. Taking advantage of the ample afternoon sunlight, Prince Roland gathered all the members of the Witch Alliance in the backyard of the castle, and the first lesson on natural biology officially began. Once all the witches were assembled, Prince Roland placed two dark gray metallic instruments on the table. The microscope he claimed could reveal the microscopic world. After placing a few drops under the microscope, Roland proceeded to teach the witches how to use it. Anna saw movement in the water, not just one but many tiny organisms resembling small insects. The witches exclaimed in surprise as they observed various organisms, each with its unique appearance. Lightning even found a seemingly transparent crab-like creature. "Your Highness, are these really all insects?" asked Scroll. Roland explained that what they were seeing were probably protists or single-celled algae, and it would be more appropriate to classify them as microorganisms rather than insects. Seeing Scroll's confusion, he continued his explanation, stating that these microorganisms were also independent life forms, although much smaller in size. In addition to the ones they were observing, there were even smaller bacteria and viruses that couldn't be observed with the current magnification of the microscope. These microorganisms were responsible for food spoilage and various diseases. Roland's enthusiasm grew as he continued his explanations. These tiny life forms were everywhere, in vast numbers. Fortunately, most of them were intolerant to high temperatures, which explained why water should be boiled before drinking, fish should be thoroughly cooked before consumption, and bathing water should not be reused. It was all due to these microorganisms' presence and the potential harm they could cause. Nightingale is drinking the water from the well, but the moment she heard there are small bugs in the water, she spat the water out. As the witches continued to discuss their individual discoveries, Lily approached the microscope, recalling Roland's words about these small organisms being the cause of food spoilage. She released her magic, enveloping the water droplet under the microscope. Unexpectedly, a remarkable transformation occurred. Some of the insects started to tremble and rapidly changed their appearance. Their previously transparent bodies became covered in purple armor, and they sprouted numerous tendrils. They began assimilating the unaffected organisms around them, but it wasn't mere consumption. Lily could see that they were assimilating at an astonishing speed, using their sharp tendrils as swords to pierce the other microorganisms and transform them into their own likeness. Nightingale suddenly felt a change in the magic behind her. She sensed a subtle vibration of magic. A swirling mass of purple mist started to form, drawing in the surrounding magic like a miniature storm. This disturbance was only visible to Nightingale, and she snapped out of her astonishment, widening her eyes and holding her breath, determined not to miss any details. Unlike Anna and Soroya, who were oblivious to the unfolding events, this was Nightingale's first-hand experience of magic condensing. The center of the storm was none other than Lily. Completely absorbed in the microscopic world beneath the microscope, Lily was completely unaware of the qualitative change in her magic within her body. Eventually, the magic gathered inward, gradually coming to a halt. It formed into a compact mass, about the size of a fist, with a round shape and 8 pairs of undulating tendrils, 4 facing downwards and 4 facing upwards. At first glance, it resembled an insect. Roland was taken by surprise when he witnessed the remarkable effects of the first natural biology class, with Lily being the third witch to undergo evolution. Seeing the microorganisms arranged so neatly under the microscope startled him. They exhibited astonishing coordination and uniformity as if they were saluting Lily. Lily became the third witch to experience an ability evolution. The next step was conducting specific experiments, including studying the effects, duration, and influence of God Punishment Stone on her ability. Perhaps Lily's ability would pave the way for medical advancements in Border Town. The testing lasted for 3 days. Despite her usual inclination to argue, Lily diligently followed Roland's instructions. Roland instructed Lily to separate the summoned purple insects into the parent organism and the replicated organisms. Whenever Lily released magic, the initial mutated microorganism would be the parent organism. As long as the mother organism had a supply of magic, it could continue to exist. However, it would self-disperse if the distance exceeded 5 meters. Moreover, it would instantly dissipate within the range of the God Punishment Stone. On the other hand, the replicated organisms were not restricted by the God Punishment Stone, appearing as a truly new form of life. They could not reproduce through division and would only live for 1 day, also being susceptible to high temperatures. Roland also mentioned that assimilating deadly bacteria and viruses could serve as a rapid anti-inflammatory and sterilization method. After coming out of the bath, Lily explained to Rem that it was possible to evolve new abilities without understanding the theory of tiny balls, cells, bacteria, and fungi. By deeply understanding one's own ability, magic could undergo a qualitative transformation. Lily yawned and confessed that she didn't understand the concepts of cells, bacteria, and fungi, but she suggested that Rem could ask Anna to teach her. However, with Anna being busy every day, Rem didn't know when to approach her. Lily jokingly proposed that Rem could ask Anna during their bath time together.